Story begins. The old man's hands did not shake when he placed the bill on the counter. That was the first thing people noticed. Hands that belonged to someone his age, somewhere past 80, skin mapped with veins and age spots, knuckles swollen from decades of use. Those hands were supposed to tremble. They always did. It was one of those quiet facts of aging that nobody discussed, like how the light changes in a room when someone very old enters it, how everything slows slightly, how the air accommodates itself around them. But these hands were perfectly, unnaturally still. The cashier at Delmar's Market on Route 9 did not notice. She was 19, bored, halfway through a shift that had contained nothing more interesting than a price check on frozen waffles and a screaming child in aisle 4. She processed transactions by reflex, her eyes never fully connecting with the people handing her money. She took the bill, held it under the ultraviolet scanner the way the training video had shown her, and that was when everything in her afternoon changed direction. The light showed nothing, no security strip, no watermark glow. She looked at the bill, then at the old man. He was watching her with pale gray eyes that did not blink as often as they should. He wore a canvas jacket that had been washed so many times it had lost its original color entirely. Brown work trousers, boots that were clean despite looking like they had walked 1,000 miles. He carried no bag, no wallet visible, just the one bill, placed flat on the counter with those steady, impossible hands. "Sir," she said, "I'm going to need to call my manager." The old man said nothing. He nodded once, but that wasn't the full story. Not by a long distance. Officer Dara Voss received the call at 2:47 in the afternoon. Suspected counterfeit currency at Delmar's Market, Route 9. Elderly male, cooperative, no signs of aggression. She had been parked behind the old grain elevator on the edge of town, eating a sandwich she had bought 3 hours earlier and forgotten about. The bread had gone slightly stale. She wrapped it back up, started the cruiser, and pulled out of the lot without urgency. Faber's Mill was the kind of town where counterfeit currency calls were either absolute mistakes or elaborate misunderstandings. Population 4,200. One main street, 2 traffic lights, a diner that had been open since 1962, and a hardware store that had been closing for the past 11 years without ever quite closing. The town existed the way all small towns exist, with the quiet confidence that nothing truly significant would ever happen here, and the private fear that one day something would. Voss had been the sole officer on rotation for rural Route 9 coverage for 6 years. She was 34, lean, kept her dark hair pulled back under the regulation cap. She had a reputation for patience in a profession that tended to burn through it. Before Faber's Mill, she had spent 3 years in the city, which had taught her things about human behavior that the small town occasionally made her forget and occasionally reminded her of sharply. She had come back home after her father died, telling herself it was temporary. Temporary had stretched into 6 years without her noticing. She pulled into Delmar's parking lot. 2 vehicles. A truck she recognized as belonging to one of the Harmon brothers. An unfamiliar sedan, dark blue, 10 years old, plates from out of state, Tennessee. She noted it without assigning meaning to it yet. Inside the market, the manager, a heavy-set man named Carroll who perpetually looked like he had just remembered something unpleasant, was standing near Register 3 with his arms folded. The young cashier was leaning against the end of the counter, watching the old man with an expression caught between discomfort and curiosity. The old man was sitting in the folding chair Carroll kept behind the service desk for his bad knee days. He was sitting with both feet flat on the floor, spine straight, hands resting on his knees, not anxious, not restless, just waiting. Voss introduced herself. He looked up at her and said, "I know why you're here. The bill." "Yes, sir. Your name?" "August." "August what?" A pause. Not a long one. The kind of pause that most people would fill with a last name without thinking. He let it sit for a beat before answering. "Keller. August Keller." "Mr. Keller, do you have identification?" "I have a driver's license." He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, making sure the officer could see every movement, and produced a worn leather billfold. The license was from Tennessee. His face on the photograph looked maybe 15 years younger. Same gray eyes, same absolute stillness. Voss took the license, noted the details, handed it back. "The bill you tendered. Can I ask where you got it?" The old man's expression shifted. "A fraction. I've had it for a long time." Carol jumped in. "The scanner flagged it, officer. No strip. Could be very old, but the design doesn't match any standard series we're aware of." Voss picked up the bill from the counter where the cashier had set it, held it up. It was a $100 bill. The paper was unusual, not degraded or brittle, but different in texture from modern currency. Heavier somehow. The printing was precise, fine-lined, the kind of detail that suggested quality rather than fraud. Franklin's face was slightly different, the engraving style older, more formal. She turned it over. The serial number caught the light. E478219003B. Something about it made her look twice. She could not have said why in that moment. Instinct, maybe. Pattern recognition built from years of paperwork and procedure. Something about the prefix. "Mr. Keller, I'm going to need to run this through our system. Standard procedure. Can I ask you to wait here?" "I'm not going anywhere," he said. And somehow the way he said it made it sound less like reassurance and more like a statement of fact about something larger than the next 20 minutes. What happened next changed everything. Voss sat in her cruiser with the engine running. She entered the serial number into the database through her MDT, the mobile data terminal mounted to her dash. The search ran. Standard results took 3 to 5 seconds. The wheel spun. 10 seconds. 15. 20. Then a flag appeared. Red border. Restricted access. Case file reference number. Below that, 3 words that she read twice before they registered. Treasury Department. Classified. Voss sat very still. The heater ran. Outside, a car pulled through the lot and continued on down Route 9. Ordinary afternoon. Town that never had anything significant happen. She tried to pull the case file. Denied. Clearance insufficient. She tried to run August Keller through the standard identity database. The name returned clean. No record. No priors. Valid license. Address in Maryville, Tennessee. Age listed as 83. She called dispatch. Asked them to run the serial number through federal channels. There was a pause on the line that was longer than it should have been. Dispatch came back and said they would need to escalate, that someone would call her back. Voss went back inside. The old man was still sitting in exactly the same position, not on his phone, not fidgeting, not asking how much longer. He looked like someone who had spent a great deal of time waiting in rooms for things to happen and had made a kind of peace with it that bordered on philosophy. "Mr. Keller," Voss said, "I'm going to be honest with you because you seem like someone who would prefer that." "Most people do, in my experience," he said. "They just rarely get it. That serial number is flagged at a federal level. I can't access the file. Someone from Treasury is going to call me back, and I don't know how long that's going to take." She paused. "Is there something you want to tell me before they do?" The old man looked at her for a long moment. The grey eyes were calm and deep in the way that still water can be deep. You cannot see the bottom, but you are aware that there is one. "There's quite a bit I could tell you," he said, "but not all of it is mine to tell yet." "What does that mean?" "It means some truths belong to the people who made them, until those people decide they're ready." He looked at his hands, those perfectly still hands. "I've been carrying this particular truth for 53 years. I think I'm close to ready." Carol, standing in the doorway to the back room, opened his mouth and then closed it again. The cashier had stopped pretending not to listen, and that's when things took a darker turn. The call came 18 minutes later. Not from Treasury. From a number with a Washington, D.C. area code that was not in any standard directory. Voss answered on the second ring. The voice on the other end was male, middle-aged, professionally neutral in the way that government voices tend to be, not unfriendly, but managed, controlled, like someone who had been trained to convey information without allowing tone to carry meaning. "Officer Voss, my name is Agent Harmon. I'm with a Joint Treasury and Intelligence Oversight Task Force. I understand you've run a query on serial number E47821903B. That's correct. I need to ask you a few questions about the individual who tendered that currency. He's with me now. Elderly male, identified as August Keller, Maryville, Tennessee. A pause. Just a fraction of a second. But Voss caught it. Officer Voss, that individual is not dangerous. I want to be very clear about that. But I need you to do something for me. I need you to ask him, just ask him, and note his exact response. I need you to ask him what his operational designation was. Voss looked across the room at the old man. He had not moved. He was watching her with an expression that suggested he already knew what the phone call was about. "Hold on," she said. She walked to him, stood in front of him. "The person I'm speaking with wants me to ask you your operational designation." August Keller's face did not change. "Tell him Meridian 4. She repeated it into the phone. Another pause, longer this time. When the voice returned, it had changed. Some carefully maintained neutrality had fractured somewhere along the edge. "Jesus," the agent said. Then, collecting himself, "Officer Voss, please do not let that man leave. I'm dispatching someone to your location. ETA approximately 90 minutes. Do you understand?" "I understand." "And Officer Voss, treat him with respect, please." The line went dead. Voss lowered the phone, looked at the old man, looked at the perfectly still hands, thought about the way he had sat in that chair for 40 minutes without a single sign of impatience. "Meridian 4, she said. "Yes." "What does that mean?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she would spend years thinking about. "It means I used to be a person the government needed, but wasn't willing to admit it knew." No one expected what came next. The 90 minutes passed in a strange kind of suspended time. Carol brought out 3 folding chairs and a coffee maker from the back room. The cashier, whose name turned out to be Britt, sat against the refrigerator case and did not pretend to be anywhere else. Voss sat across from the old man. The afternoon light came through the market's front windows at a low angle, the October sun already retreating toward the horizon by 4 o'clock. August Keller drank his coffee in small, deliberate sips. He did not offer information, but he did not refuse questions either. He answered the ones that had answers he was willing to give, and he was honest about the ones he wasn't. "How long were you in Faber's Mill?" Voss asked. "Since April. I've been moving around, staying a few weeks in each place, then moving on." He considered. "This is the first time I've used any of the original currency." The original currency. There were 12 bills. This was the first I spent. I kept the others. For 53 years. For 53 years. Voss absorbed this. Outside, a truck went past on Route 9. The coffee maker gurgled. Britt had gotten herself a candy bar from the rack near the register and was eating it with the focused attention of someone who had nothing else to focus on. "Mr. Keller," Voss said, "I'm going to ask you something directly, and I want you to understand, I'm not asking as a law enforcement officer, I'm asking as a person." He looked at her. "Go ahead. Are you okay?" Something shifted in the old man's face. It was small and quick, and it passed before she could fully name it. But it was real. A crack in the composure. The kind of thing you see in someone who has been asked a question they forgot, had an answer. "That's a complicated question," he said finally. "I know. That's why I asked it." He looked at his hands, the still impossible hands. "I'm tired," he said. "I've been tired for a long time, but I'm here, so I suppose that's something." And then, before she could ask anything else, headlights swept through the front windows. A vehicle turning into the parking lot. Voss stood, hand moving to the vicinity of her sidearm by instinct. 2 vehicles, black SUVs, federal plates. But that wasn't the full story. Not yet. 3 people got out of the vehicles. 2 men and a woman. All in civilian clothes that somehow announced federal employment anyway. Wrong cut, wrong shoes, that particular quality of attention to the environment that comes from training rather than habit. The woman was the one in front, mid-50s, Gray-streaked hair cut short and practical. She carried nothing. She walked like someone accustomed to walking into rooms where she would be the most important person present. She entered the market, scanned the room. Her eyes landed on the old man and stayed there. She walked to him, stopped 2 feet away, looked at him with an expression that was complicated. Professional assessment layered over something older and less controlled. "Meridian 4, she said. "That's one of my names," he agreed. "My name is Director Walsh. I run the Office of Historical Intelligence Operations. Do you know why I'm here?" "Because a 19-year-old scanner at a grocery store flagged a 53-year-old bill." He tilted his head slightly. "I expected it would happen eventually. I chose Faber's Mill because it's the kind of place where people have time to follow up." Walsh looked at him for a long moment. Then she pulled the other folding chair forward, the one Voss had been sitting in, and sat down across from him. Not standing over him, sitting at eye level. "The bill is real," she said. "Not counterfeit. I know it's real. It's from the Treasury consignment that was listed as stolen in December 1971. $1,200 bills, never recovered. 3 agents died in connection with that theft. The case has been open for 53 years. "I know," the old man said. "I was there." The room had gone absolutely silent. Britt had stopped chewing. Carroll was standing in the doorway, with his hand pressed against the doorframe like he needed it for balance. Voss felt something cold and electric move through the back of her neck. "Which side were you on?" Walsh asked. August Keller looked at her steadily. "That depends entirely on how you define sides," he said, "and on what you're willing to accept as the truth." What happened next changed everything. He began to talk. Not immediately. He finished his coffee first, set the cup down on the floor beside the chair. He looked at his hands for a moment, the way a person looks at tools they have depended on for a long time. Then he looked up at Walsh, at Voss, at the strange small audience gathered in a roadside market on a Tuesday afternoon in October. "My name, my real name, is August Caldwell," he said. "Keller is a name that was given to me in 1972. There was a document, a new identity, thorough enough to hold for 50 years, apparently." He allowed a thin, humorless expression. "The people who built it were good at what they did." "Who built it?" Walsh asked. "The agency, your predecessors, the version of the office that existed in 1972 before 3 reorganizations and 2 congressional oversight committees changed everything." He paused. "They built me a new life because the old one had become inconvenient." "Inconvenient how?" "Because I knew things. Specifically, I knew what actually happened to the Treasury consignment on December 14, 1971. He looked at Walsh directly. "I knew because I was there. I was 29 years old. I was 2 years into my first operational assignment, and what happened that night in the warehouse on Delancey Street in Lower Manhattan was not a theft." Voss heard her own breathing. The electric feeling in her neck had spread to her shoulders. "What was it?" Walsh asked. "It was a sanctioned retrieval," Keller said. "The money was moved, deliberately, off the official ledger, into an operational fund that didn't officially exist." Walsh did not move. Her expression did not change. But her hands, Voss noticed, had shifted slightly in her lap. "To fund what?" Walsh asked. The old man looked at her for a long time. "That," he said quietly, "is the part that took me 53 years to figure out who to tell." And that's when things took a darker turn. He had been a young man with too much ambition and too little understanding of the difference between ambition and recklessness. That was how August Caldwell, the man who would become August Keller, described himself in 1969 when he was first recruited. He had a background in mathematics, specifically in cryptographic systems and financial pattern analysis. He could look at streams of numbers and find the signal inside the noise. He had done it for a private firm, then for a consulting contract, then for a government contractor, and then one afternoon a woman had sat down across from him at lunch in a DC cafe and told him he was being offered something better. The woman's name had been Frances Aldred. She was 20 years his senior, silver-haired, wore reading glasses she did not need as a prop to seem less threatening. She had run 3 covert financial networks during her career. She had never been officially acknowledged by any of them. What she told me, Keller said, was that there was a program, highly compartmentalized, operating inside the standard intelligence structure, but not quite part of it. A financial intelligence unit that tracked the movement of money rather than people. Money trails that led to things that human surveillance could never reach. Networks, relationships, leverage points. Operational financial analysis, Walsh said. She was nodding slightly, not in agreement, not in recognition. You've heard of it. I've seen the edges of the files. They were sealed in 1978, before my time, before a lot of people's time. He folded his hands together on his knees. The program was called Stonework. It ran from 1967 to 1972. 5 years. 14 active analysts at its peak. The goal was to map the financial underpinnings of hostile networks, not foreign powers, not in the way you might think. Domestic, political extremism on both sides. Organized crime intersecting with political violence. The money behind the movements. Britt had forgotten entirely about the candy bar. Carol had sat down in the folding chair by the door. And the treasury money? Voss asked. Keller turned to look at her. In all the time since Walsh had arrived, this was the first time he had addressed Voss directly, and she felt the full weight of those gray eyes. The treasury money was supposed to fund a final operation, he said. A financial sting, tracing cash through a network that Stonework had been mapping for 18 months. 3 agents were assigned to escort the consignment to a secure facility in New Jersey, where it would be marked and released into the target network. He stopped. Those 3 agents died, Walsh said, in connection with the theft. Yes, he said. But they didn't die because the money was stolen. They died because someone inside Stonework decided the final operation was too much, too close to people who were too important. Someone made a call. The operation was terminated. The agents were sent into a situation they didn't know had been compromised. He paused. The money disappeared into the dark, and I was the only analyst who had mapped the full trail. Silence. Then, "What happened to you?" Voss asked. "They offered me a choice," he said. "The same kind of choice that tends to get made in basements of buildings that don't have plaques on them. Disappear willingly into a new identity, full support, new documents, a house in Tennessee, enough money to live on. Or they would construct a very convincing case that I had been the one who tipped off the people who compromised the operation, that I had been the source of the leak, that the 3 agents' deaths were, in part, my responsibility." The October light had gone from gold to gray. The market's fluorescent tubes hummed. Outside, Route 9 was quiet. "You took the deal," Walsh said. "I was 29 years old," he said, "and the men who were making the offer were not people who made empty threats." No one spoke for a moment. "But you kept the bills," Voss said. He looked at her again. This time something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something that might become one, if given the right conditions. 12 bills. I kept them because they were the only physical proof that the operation existed, that the money was real, that I was there. He paused. I kept them because I knew that someday, maybe, the world would change enough that it would be safe to surface. And when that day came, I wanted to have something tangible to show. He looked at the bill Walsh now held in her hand. I wanted to be a witness, not just a story, a witness with evidence. No one expected what came next. Walsh stood. She walked to the window and stood with her back to the room for a moment. Then she turned around. "Mr. Caldwell, Mr. Keller, whoever you are right now." She paused. "Do you understand the weight of what you're claiming?" "I've had 53 years to understand it," he said. "The people you're describing, the people who ran Stonework, who made the call, who built your new identity, they're mostly dead." "Not all of them," he said. "One of them is very much alive, lives in Connecticut, has a very comfortable retirement from a very distinguished career." He paused. "His name is Charles Mott. He is currently 78 years old. He currently serves on the advisory board of 2 foundations and is considered by 3 different biographers to be a significant figure in American intelligence history. Walsh's face did not change, but something behind her eyes did. "You know that name," Keller said. Not a question. "I know that name," Walsh confirmed carefully. "He was the one who terminated Stonework. He was the one who decided the final operation was too expensive politically. He was the one who sent 3 agents into a compromised situation. And he was the one who offered me the choice in the basement of a building in Langley on a Thursday evening in February 1972. Voss felt like the floor had shifted slightly beneath her. She had been a police officer for 9 years. She had dealt with domestic situations and car accidents and one very strange incident involving a stolen tractor. She had never stood in a room where history was being rewritten in real time. "You have documentation?" Walsh asked. "Not here. There's a storage unit in Maryville, Tennessee, a unit I've been paying cash rent on since 1973. 50 years of cash payments in an envelope left in a mailbox." He paused. "Inside the unit are the original Stonework analysis files, copies I made before I disappeared. Maps of the financial network, names, dates, the trail. Evidence. Evidence," he agreed. "And testimony, my testimony, which I am now willing to give." Walsh looked at him for a very long time. Then she did something that Voss did not expect. She said, "Why now, after 53 years? Why this particular October in Faber's Mill?" And for the first time since Voss had entered the market, August Keller's composure genuinely cracked. It was not dramatic. There was no visible tears, no breaking voice. It was something quieter and more devastating than that. It was the expression of someone who has held a weight for so long that the holding of it has become part of their identity, and who has finally, at the end of something, allowed themselves to acknowledge that they are exhausted. "Because I'm 83 years old," he said, "and this is the only true thing I ever did, and I don't want it to die with me." But that wasn't the full story. There were things he had not said. Walsh could feel them in the room, the things around the edges of what he told her, the shapes visible in the negative space between his words. She had been in this work for 30 years. She knew what the full accounting looked like versus the partial one. She sent her 2 deputies outside. She nodded at Voss, who to her credit read the situation and moved to the front of the store, giving them distance without leaving. Carol and Britt had the sensitivity to find somewhere else to be. Walsh sat back down across from the old man. Just the 2 of them, in the dimming afternoon light of a small-town market. "The 3 agents," she said. "Tell me about them." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you know about them?" "I know their names. I know they were listed as killed in the line of duty. Their families received full benefits. Official story was an operational accident." "Operational accident," he repeated. The 2 words carried decades of bitterness in their container. "Tell me the truth," Walsh said. "The part you left out." He looked at the window, at the last gray light outside, at Route 9 and the empty parking lot, and the outline of hills against the darkening sky. "The youngest one was 24, he said. "Her name was Marion Reese. She had been with the program for 6 months. She was brilliant, the most naturally gifted financial analyst I had ever seen. She could track a money trail through 7 layers of shell companies in 40 minutes. She was going to be extraordinary." Walsh said nothing. Let him find the pace. The other 2 were experienced, Hadley and Brooks. Both had families. Hadley had a daughter who would have been 2 years old at the time. He paused. "I knew them. I worked with them. They were the 3 people closest to me in the program." He stopped. "They were the 3 people who knew what I knew, who had access to the same analysis I had." Walsh felt something cold clarify in her thinking. "They weren't just sent into a compromised situation," she said slowly. "No," Keller said. "They weren't. They were sent because they knew. Yes. And you were offered the deal instead of the same fate because I had something they didn't," he said. "I had made copies, and they knew it. I had told Mott directly in that basement in Langley that I had documentation. that if anything happened to me, it was already in a place he couldn't reach. He paused. I bluffed. At the time I bluffed. But I made the copies afterward, as soon as I had my new identity established. As soon as I was August Keller and had a house in Tennessee and thought I might actually live. His voice had gone very quiet. I made the copies for them. Marion, Hadley, Brooks. Because I couldn't do anything else for them. Because they were already gone. Walsh sat very still. I've carried that, he said. For 53 years. I've carried the fact that I lived because I talked, and they died because they didn't. The market was completely silent. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to have stopped humming. Mr. Caldwell, Walsh said carefully, what you just described is not guilt. What you're describing is survival. You were 29 years old, and powerful men threatened your life. I know what it is, he said. I know what it isn't too. I've had 53 years to know both things. He looked at her. But knowing what something is doesn't change what it feels like to carry it. And that's when things took a darker turn. Walsh made calls. Standing outside the market in the cold October dark, she made 3 calls in quick succession. She moved away from the vehicles, away from her deputies, away from anyone who could read her expression. The first call was to her deputy director. The second was to a special counsel in the Attorney General's office. The third was to a number she had memorized and never stored in any device. She stood in the parking lot of Delmar's Market on Route 9 in Faber's Mill, watching her own breath fog in the cold air, and she had a conversation that rearranged the professional landscape of everything she knew about her own career. Charles Mott. The name was not unknown to her. The man was not unknown to her. He had sat across from her at 2 separate briefings in her early career. He had shaken her hand at the retirement ceremony of a mutual colleague. He had a face she knew, a voice she recognized. He existed in the category of fixtures, the people who had been around so long they had become part of the architecture. The third call ended. Walsh stood for a moment longer, looking up at the rural dark sky, at the dense scatter of stars visible out here away from city light. Then she went back inside. Voss was standing near the coffee maker. Walsh looked at her. "How are you doing?" Walsh asked. Voss considered this seriously, which Walsh appreciated. "I called in from my shift an hour ago. My sergeant wants a report. I don't know what to put in it. Write what you observed. Man presented currency. Currency was flagged. Federal agents responded. Ongoing federal investigation." Walsh paused. "Your role in this is significant. You were the point of contact. That matters." "What happens to him?" Voss asked. Walsh looked across the room at August Keller, who had accepted a second cup of coffee from Carol and was holding it in both hands. Those still extraordinary hands. "That's going to be a complicated question to answer," Walsh said honestly. "The bills are technically evidence in an open case. The documentation he has in Tennessee is going to need to be examined by people with the right clearance. The testimony is going to need to be formalized. And after that? After that, I genuinely don't know. What he's described is going to require a very careful process." She paused. "But the man is 83 years old, and he's been carrying this since he was 29. Whatever happens legally, he deserves to put it down." Voss nodded slowly. "For what it's worth," Walsh said, "the fact that he used that bill here, in your town today, the fact that you followed procedure and ran the serial, that's the reason any of this is happening. You were the mechanism." She paused. "Not everything has clean outcomes, but some things get started in the right direction, because the right person does their job carefully on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon." No one expected what came next. It was Carol who noticed it first. He had returned to his position near the service desk, moving with the careful quiet of a man determined not to disturb whatever was happening in his store. He was straightening a rack of candy near the register when he looked up and said, without alarm but with clear significance, "There's another car outside." Walsh was at the window in 2 steps. A silver sedan. Out-of-state plates. Not Tennessee, Virginia. The car was parked at the far end of the lot, facing the building. Engine on, visible exhaust in the cold air. Nobody getting out. Her deputies were already moving. Walsh held up a hand, stopping them. She looked at Keller. He had turned in his chair to look at the window. He had seen the car. His face was completely calm, but there was something in his posture that had shifted. Something subtle, a compression of attention, a gathering that Voss recognized without being able to name it. "Do you know that vehicle?" Walsh asked. "No," he said, "but I know what it represents." "Explain." "When I called the storage facility this morning to confirm it was still active, I've called every 6 months for 50 years to confirm it's still active. I used the phone at the motel on Route 12, public phone, old habit." He paused. "Old habits from an old life tend to be correct habits." But public phones in motels still have cameras now," he said. "Some things I've kept up with, some I haven't." Walsh pulled out her radio, directed her deputies to approach the vehicle carefully. Standard protocol, identify the occupants. She watched through the window, her jaw set. The two deputies walked across the parking lot. They were halfway to the silver sedan when the vehicle's brake lights lit up and it reversed, quick but not panicked, out of the lot and onto Route 9, accelerating north. Walsh got the plates and called them in. Virginia registration. The name it came back to was a consulting firm with an address in D.C. that her deputy director, 15 minutes later, would confirm was a known front for private intelligence contractors. The kind of firm that existed to do things for people who needed distance from those things. When Walsh walked back to August Keller, she did not pretend what she was about to say was anything other than what it was. "The car is connected to people who do private work for individuals who want problems managed," she said. "Based on what you've told me tonight, I can guess who hired them." "Can you protect him?" Voss asked. The question surprised herself. She had not intended to speak. Walsh looked at her, then at Keller. "Yes," she said. And then, more carefully, "It will require moving quickly and very formally." She picked up her phone again. "I'm going to need you to formally invoke federal witness protection protocols, Mr. Caldwell. That requires your consent and a declaration of intent to cooperate with a federal investigation." The old man set down his coffee cup. He placed his hands on his knees again, those still, extraordinary hands. He looked at them for a moment. "Marion Reese," he said. "Hadley. Brooks." He looked up at Walsh. "You'll say their names. Whatever comes from this, you'll make sure their names are part of the record." "I give you my word," Walsh said. He nodded. "Then yes," he said. "I consent." But that wasn't the full story. The storage unit in Maryville, Tennessee was opened the following morning under federal supervision. Walsh was there herself, which was not protocol and which she did not care about. 2 forensic analysts from the Treasury Historical Recovery Division, a special counsel, and Voss, who had formally requested to be present, and whose request Walsh had approved without hesitation. The unit was 10 feet by 15. Climate-controlled. Keller had paid extra for that every year, cash in the envelope, 53 years of careful anonymous payments. Inside, the walls were lined with archive boxes, labeled, dated, indexed. The forensic analyst who opened the first box said quietly, after 30 seconds of examination, "This is meticulous." She sounded awed. The files were complete. The financial network maps were hand-drawn on drafting paper in a precise architectural style. Columns of figures, connecting lines, coded references that Keller spent 3 hours walking the analysts through. The copies of the Stonework analysis were on paper that had aged but remained completely legible, preserved in archival sleeves. The documentation of the December 14, 1971 operation was in its own box, labeled simply, "The Night of." Inside were transaction records, routing documents, the original operational orders, and a handwritten account, 47 pages, small, precise script, that Keller had written from memory in the first weeks of his new life, while it was all still perfectly clear. He sat in a folding chair inside the storage unit, watching people handle documents that had not been touched by other hands in 50 years, and Voss sat beside him because it seemed like the right thing to do, and she had stopped questioning her instincts about what was right. "How did you do it?" she asked quietly. 53 years, a whole different life." He was quiet for a moment. "You build routines," he said. "Routines become a life, if you build enough of them. Work, a house, the same path for morning walks, books from the library, neighbors who know you as someone quiet and reliable." He paused. "After a while, you stop thinking of it as pretending. Do you have people, family?" "A nephew in Oregon, son of a sister who died in 2009. He knows me as Uncle August, visits at Christmas." A pause. "He looks like my father." "Does he know?" "No, he'll find out." He was quiet. "That's one of the things I hadn't solved. How to tell him." He looked at his hands. "I suppose I'll have help with that now." The special counsel came over with a document. Formal, legal, several pages. He explained it carefully and without condescension, which Voss appreciated. Keller listened with complete attention, asked 2 clarifying questions, then signed, in a handwriting that was precise and architectural, matching the documentation around him. August Caldwell, his real name, for the first time in 53 years. Walsh watched him sign it. Her expression was complicated in the way that expressions become when professional duty and human feeling are pulling in the same direction rather than opposite ones. What happened next changed everything. 3 weeks after the events at Del Mar's Market, a grand jury was convened in a federal courthouse in Washington. The proceedings were sealed. The testimony was classified. None of the public-facing story had emerged yet, and Walsh was doing everything in her carefully calibrated power to ensure it emerged correctly when it did. Charles Mott was interviewed at his home in Connecticut on a Tuesday morning. 2 agents arrived at 8:15 a.m. He offered them coffee, which they declined. He listened to what they told him with the practiced equanimity of a man who had spent his career in rooms where bad news arrived regularly. Then he said he wanted to speak to his attorney before saying anything further. His attorney was very good. The proceedings that followed were going to be very long. Voss heard about this through Walsh, who called her twice during the following weeks, once to update her on the formal filing, and once just to ask how she was doing. Voss found this extraordinary. She said so. Walsh said she had found extraordinary things tended to create obligations. In Faber's Mill, the immediate gossip was significant. Carol was constitutionally unable to not discuss what had happened in his store, and Britt told her friends, and her friends told their friends, and within 3 days the general understanding in town was that something federal and significant had happened at Del Mar's on a Tuesday, though the details were vague and multiplied with each telling. Voss declined to comment, which only made the speculation richer. She drove out to the motel on Route 12 one afternoon, just to see it. The public phone was still there, mounted on the wall outside the ice machine. Old beige plastic. The kind of phone that had been installed in the early 90s and never replaced because nobody had complained. She looked at the camera mounted above the motel office entrance, angled just enough to catch the phone. 53 years of careful habits and one small modern detail he had not accounted for. She thought about what Walsh had said, that she had been the mechanism, the person whose ordinary procedure on an ordinary afternoon had opened the door. She thought about Marion Reese, Hadley, Brooks, 3 people who had died in a warehouse in Lower Manhattan in 1971 because powerful men had decided the truth was inconvenient. 3 people whose names were going to be formally entered into the record of the investigation, whose families, whoever was left of them a generation later, were going to receive a phone call that would be terrible and clarifying and something they would spend the rest of their lives processing. She thought about a 29-year-old man in a basement in Langley, being offered a choice by people who were very good at making certain choices feel inevitable. She thought about a storage unit, 50 years of cash payments in an envelope, 47 pages of handwritten testimony, preserved with the patience of someone who believed, against all evidence, that someday the truth would matter enough to surface. She got back in her cruiser, sat for a moment, The October sky had given way to November, first frost on the fields in the morning, the hills going from gold to brown, winter coming with its particular quality of finality. Her radio crackled. Dispatch. A fender bender on the county road north of town. Minor. No injuries. She acknowledged, pulled out of the motel lot, drove toward it. But that wasn't the full story. Not quite. The letter arrived in late November. Formal letterhead, Office of Historical Intelligence Operations. Addressed to Officer Dara Voss, Faber's Mill Police Department. It informed her that the investigation opened on October 14th had progressed to formal federal review, that the documentation recovered from the Maryville storage facility had been authenticated by 3 independent forensic teams, that the testimony of August Caldwell, formerly operating under the designation Meridian 4, had been formally entered into the federal record, that the names of Marion Reese, Thomas Hadley, and James Brooks had been submitted for posthumous commendation as part of the Operation Stonework historical recognition process. The final paragraph was not standard language. She could tell because it did not read like the rest of the letter. Officer Voss, your professional conduct on October 14th initiated a process that has been 53 years in the making. The individuals named above died without recognition. The man who survived them has carried their memory without recognition. Because of a properly conducted routine inquiry on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, both of those things are in the process of changing. That matters. Director Walsh. Voss folded the letter, put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, drove her route. She did not tell Carol about it, did not tell Britt, did not mention it in conversation at the diner where she ate lunch 3 times a week. She carried it the way she had learned to carry the things that mattered, quietly, without display, with the private understanding that some things are significant without requiring an audience. November became December. The investigation continued in its sealed proceedings far away from Route 9. Walsh called once more, just before Christmas, with an update she was not obligated to give. Mott's attorneys were negotiating. The process was moving. "What about him?" Voss asked. "August. He's in a secure location we arranged for the duration of the investigation. After that," Walsh paused. "He asked specifically if he could go back to Tennessee, to his house. He said it's the only place where the routines are his." Voss thought about that. A man building routines into a life over 50 years. Routines that became real. A house in Tennessee where the neighbors knew him as quiet and reliable. "I hope he gets to," she said. "So do I," Walsh said. No one expected what came next. The next morning, Voss arrived at the station at 6:45, earlier than her shift required. She poured coffee from the station machine, worse than the diners, worse than the markets, consistently the worst coffee available anywhere along Route 9, and sat at her desk and looked at her notes from the previous day. She had written them the previous night, at her kitchen table before sleep. Long habit from her city years. Write the notes while the details are still vivid. Date, time, sequence of events, exact language used, quotations marked with quotation marks, impressions noted separately as impressions. She read through them now. The sequence was clear. Ordinary call, flagged currency. Procedure followed, results unexpected. What she had not written in her notes, because police notes are not personal journals, was what she had felt in the room. The quality of the silence after Keller spoke. The way Walsh's controlled professional expression had fractured and recovered throughout the evening. The particular weight of watching an 83-year-old man put his real name on a document for the first time in 53 years. She filed the formal report. Standard language. Ongoing federal investigation. Refer all inquiries to federal liaison. She emailed it to her sergeant, who would forward it to the relevant people, and who would have questions she was not yet authorized to answer. Her sergeant, a man named Brogan, who had been policing the rural county for 22 years and who processed most events with the philosophical equanimity of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by much, called her at 9:15. "Treasury Department," he said. "That's new." "Yes, sir." The old man in Carroll's Market. Yes, sir. You can't tell me what it's about. Not yet, sir. Federal investigation. Active proceedings. Brogan was quiet for a moment. You did everything right? I followed procedure. Good. A pause. You need anything from me? No, sir. Not at the moment. Okay. Check in when you can. He hung up. Voss sat with the phone for a moment. The station was quiet. Her colleague Pettiford was on the other side of the room running a background check on something unrelated, drinking his own coffee, paying no attention. The dispatch board was calm. The radio was murmuring routine traffic. She thought about ordinary mornings, about how ordinary mornings were the baseline against which everything else was measured. She picked up her keys, went back out to Route 9. In the weeks that followed, Voss found herself thinking about the Stonework analysts in ways that surprised her. Not the grand version of them, not the official record, not the names and documents, but the specific human version. Marion Reese, 24 years old, brilliant with numbers, going to be extraordinary. Thomas Hadley, family man, a daughter who had been 2 years old in 1971 and who was now in her mid-50s somewhere, living a life built on a history she didn't fully know. James Brooks, whose details Keller had not given that evening in the market. She looked up what she could find through public records, not classified material. She had no access to that, but the surface layer of public record that exists for everyone. Marion Reese appeared in a 1970 college commencement program, mathematics honors. A brief notice from a Connecticut newspaper about a young woman who had taken a federal position. Then nothing. Gap. The official death notice in 1972 that Walsh had referenced, brief, vague, operational accident, no details. Thomas Hadley had a LinkedIn page maintained by a relative, probably a grandchild, based on the activity, that listed him as a veteran and federal employee. A few photographs, clearly scanned from old prints. Hadley looked like someone's good-natured uncle. He had been 31 when he died. Brooks was harder to find, common name. She couldn't be sure which results were him. She closed the searches, sat with the weight of the absence. 3 people who had done work that the country benefited from without knowing it, who had died because someone with power had decided they were less important than convenience, whose families had carried incomplete truths for 50 years. The daughter would be in her mid-50s now, Thomas Hadley's daughter, probably had children of her own, probably had told the story of her father the way she understood it, killed in the line of duty, operational accident, proud of him, but kept from the full knowing. And somewhere in December, she had received a call, or a letter, or a visit. Voss did not know the details. She didn't need to. She could feel the shape of it from the outside. Some things are better known in outline, Walsh had said. Some things are better known completely, Voss thought. Even when complete knowing is painful, especially then. Because incomplete knowing is its own particular kind of damage, carried forward through generations, a weight whose shape nobody fully understands because nobody will name it directly. She drove her route. The October hills had moved through gold and orange and were now brown and bare. The fields were harvested. The valley looked open in the way it only looked in late autumn, when the trees had surrendered their leaves and the land was visible in its actual bones. She thought about a man building routines into a life over 50 years. January 1973, Tennessee, first winter as August Keller. He had written, "I have decided that the only way to survive this is to become genuinely good at being August Keller." She wondered if he had managed it. She thought from what she had seen in Carroll's Market on that Tuesday afternoon that he probably had. The man who sat in that folding chair for 40 minutes without a sign of impatience, that was not performance. That was 50 years of cultivated stillness. The hands that did not shake. The gray eyes that processed the room without alarm. The voice that carried authority without demanding it. He had become someone who deserved to exist. She hoped that was something. No one expected what came next. Walsh called in mid-November with an update she framed carefully. "I want to keep you informed," she said, "within the parameters of what I can share at this stage." "I appreciate that," Voss said. The documentation from the Maryville unit has been fully authenticated. 3 independent teams. The financial analysis maps match known records from other sources that we've been able to identify. The testimony aligns with physical evidence at a level that's, frankly, it's remarkable, given the circumstances under which it was preserved. He was meticulous, Voss said. The analyst in the storage unit used that word. Yes, he was trained to be. And then he spent 50 years being, whether or not he was using the training. Walsh paused. The preliminary review has been filed with the special counsel. The proceedings are moving. And the families? A pause. I reached out personally, Walsh said, to Reese's surviving family. A sister, still alive, 81, lives in New Hampshire. To Hadley's daughter, to Brooks's son, who lives in Colorado. A longer pause. Those were difficult conversations, but the right ones. How did they respond? With the particular quality of reaction that comes when someone finally understands a shape they've been carrying blind for their entire life. Walsh was quiet for a moment. Hadley's daughter cried for most of our conversation. Then she asked very precise, intelligent questions. She's an attorney. She handled the grief and the professional assessment simultaneously. A pause. She reminds me of Keller, actually, in the way she compresses things. Brooks's son, quiet, asked if his father had been brave. I told him the evidence suggested his father was extremely brave. He said, good, and then asked about the legal process. Walsh paused. People process these things in the order their character allows. Voss sat with this for a moment. Walsh, she said, can I ask you something? Yes. When you walked into that market, when you saw him sitting in that chair, what did you think? Walsh was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Voss thought she might not answer. I thought, here is a man who did something I recognize, Walsh said finally. Not the specific choices, but the quality of them. The particular experience of knowing something true and being unable to say it, of carrying evidence and waiting for the world to be ready. A pause. That experience is not uncommon in the work I do. What was uncommon was the duration. 53 years. She stopped. I thought, he's been so patient, and I didn't know whether to admire it or grieve it. Both, maybe, Voss said. Both, Walsh agreed. December came. The investigation continued. The formal unsealing process moved through its various stages. Legal review, classification assessment, the careful negotiation between what needed to remain protected and what needed to become public. Voss spent December doing the ordinary work of her ordinary route. She wrote 3 accident reports. She investigated a series of thefts from outbuildings on farms north of town that turned out to be the work of 2 teenagers, with a complicated justification for their actions. She helped direct traffic around a downed power line one Tuesday morning that blocked the main intersection for 4 hours and created the most significant traffic event Faber's Mill had experienced in several years. She ate lunch at the diner 3 times a week. She ran her route. She went home to her house in the evenings. She read the Stonework notebook in installments. The notebook was not easy reading, not because of prose. The handwriting was clear, the language precise, because of content. A young man in 1973 trying to decide if his own survival was something he was allowed to feel good about. An entry in 1974 that was just a date and a single line. 3 years. Then nothing for 2 months. Then, I saw a newspaper photograph of the building on Delancey Street today. It's a restaurant now. A family eating at a table in the window. A long section in 1976 about his morning walks. The same path every day, the same landmarks. The way the light changed over the same trees through different seasons. The way familiarity, repeated enough, becomes something that feels like belonging even when you know its foundations are artificial. An entry in 1983. I have started to wonder if August Caldwell and August Keller are really different people or just different configurations of the same person. I don't know if this is adaptation or surrender. I choose to call it adaptation. 1991. My neighbor's daughter asked me today if I had children. I said no. She said that was a shame. I seemed like I would have been good at it. I thought about this for the rest of the day. I still don't know what to make of it. 2001, September. There is something disorienting about watching everyone around you process a shared catastrophe when your own has been private for 30 years. Everyone is talking. Everyone is asking, how do we carry this? I know how you carry it, you just do. 2009, sister died. The last person who knew me as myself. At the funeral, her son, my nephew, who calls me Uncle August, gave a eulogy that mentioned my father, our father. He said our father was a man of tremendous discipline and great kindness. He looked at me when he said it. He didn't know that he was also describing someone else. Voss read that entry twice, set the book down, picked it up again. 2019, 50 years. I calculated it today. 50 years since Francis Aldred sat across from me at lunch in Washington and said I was being offered something better. Half a century since the thing that defined me happened. The thing I can't say out loud to anyone who knows me as August Keller. I think about Marion most years around this time. December. She would have been 73. She would, I believe, have been extraordinary. The last section of the notebook was the one Voss returned to most often. The final 18 months, Keller's, Caldwell's, slow and deliberate preparation. Not a dramatic countdown, not a sudden decision. A gradual, careful construction of readiness. He had written, in April of the previous year, I've been thinking about witnesses. Not official witnesses, human ones. People who will be in the room when truth surfaces and who will carry it forward correctly. Not because they're assigned to. Because they're the kind of people who do. I don't know who that person will be. I'm going to have to trust that they exist. She was in Delmar's Market on a Tuesday afternoon in October because of a schedule change. Her colleague Pettiford had a dentist appointment, and she had covered his early patrol, which put her 10 miles north of where she would otherwise have been at 2:47 p.m. A dentist appointment. The fragile machinery of small circumstances. She had run the serial number because she ran serial numbers, because that was the procedure, because she was the kind of officer who did not skip steps in routines, even when skipping them would have been faster and easier and completely unnoticed. She had gone back inside and been honest with him. I'm going to be honest with you because you seem like someone who would prefer that, because that was how she had learned to work. Because her father, who had been a county deputy for 31 years before cancer took him in 2017, had told her once that the only irreplaceable thing you bring to the job is your own willingness to be straight with people. Everything else can be trained, that can only be chosen. She was the witness, the one he had trusted would exist. She sat with the closed notebook and let that settle. Not with grandiosity. There was nothing grand about it. She had done her job correctly. She had asked a human question. She had stayed in the room. It was enough. In the calculus of what mattered, it was exactly enough. In January, Voss received a package. Small, padded envelope. Tennessee postmark. No return address. Inside was a single item, a small book. Pocket-sized. Old. The cover was worn leather, the pages edged with age. It was a blank notebook, the kind used for personal records. When she opened it, she understood why it had been sent. The first page had a handwritten note, small, precise, architectural script. I kept this during my years as August Keller. I wrote in it what I could not say to anyone. It does not contain operational information, nothing classified, nothing that belongs to the investigation. It contains only the private record of a man trying to exist inside a lie while remaining faithful to a truth. I've been told I may give it to someone I trust to understand it correctly. I am giving it to you because you asked me if I was okay. In 53 years, only one person ever asked me that. August Caldwell. Voss sat at her kitchen table with the book in her hands for a long time. Outside, January dark, the house quiet, the particular silence of a rural winter that has settled in fully and intends to stay. She opened to the first page of writing. January 1973, Tennessee, first winter as August Keller. She read the first entry, then the second. Then she set the book down, not because she wanted to stop, but because she needed a moment with what she was reading. The handwriting was the same throughout, precise, architectural, but the content was the voice of a young man who had done something irreversible and was learning to live inside its consequences, who went to the grocery store and bought milk and bread as August Keller and drove home to a house that was his and was not his, who watched the news and saw the world continuing its ordinary revolutions and felt himself rotating at a different speed, offset, slightly out of phase with everything around him, who had written on March 15, 1973, "I have decided that the only way to survive this is to become genuinely good at being August Keller, not to pretend, not to perform, but to actually become someone who deserves to exist. I don't know if that's possible. I'm going to try." She read until midnight. The book was 230 pages, 50 years of entries, sparse in some years, dense in others. She did not finish it that night. She finished it over the following week, reading in the evenings, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The last entry was dated October 12th, 2 days before he had walked into Delmar's Market. "Tomorrow I'm going to spend that first bill. I've decided. I don't know exactly what will happen, but I know that nothing will happen if I don't start it. Marion, Hadley, Brooks. I'm 53 years late. I'm starting now." Voss sat with the closed book in her hands. The January wind moved through the eaves of the house. She thought about old men with still hands, about choices made in basements, about truths preserved in storage units for half a century, about the particular quality of patience required to wait, not with certainty of outcome, but with commitment to the attempt. She thought about 3 agents who had died in a warehouse in 1971 and whose families had received a package in December with a letter explaining what had really happened. She had heard about that from Walsh. She had not asked for the details. Some things were better known in outline. She thought about a young woman named Marion Reese, who had been 24 years old and who could track a money trail through 7 layers of shell companies in 40 minutes and who was going to be extraordinary. Voss set the book on the shelf above her kitchen table, between a photograph of her father and a ceramic jar she had bought at a craft fair and never used. It looked like it belonged there, like it had been part of the shelf's story all along, waiting for the right position. But that wasn't the full story. There was one more thing. In February, 5 months after the events at Delmar's Market, the first unsealed documents from the Stonework investigation became public record. They were released through the National Archives, technical documents, financial records, the kind of dense material that most people would not read. But they contained names: Marion Reese, Thomas Hadley, James Brooks, Operation Stonework, 1967 to 1972. 3 journalists picked up the story. One of them was thorough and careful, and interviewed Walsh on background. The piece that resulted was not sensational. It was precise. It named Mott, whose legal proceedings were ongoing and therefore careful language was required, and it named the 3 agents who had died without recognition, and it named the Stonework program and what it had accomplished in its 5 years of operation. Voss read the article on a Saturday morning at the diner. She drank her coffee. A few people in the diner had seen it too and were talking about it in the particular way that small towns talk about things that turn out to have been partially their story. Carol came in at 10, sat across from her, pointed at his phone. "That's what happened in my store," he said. "That's what happened in your store," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That old man, he did the right thing." "Yes," she said. "He did. Took a long time. He was waiting for the right moment." Carol thought about this. 53 years is a long wait for the right moment. "Some moments take that long to arrive," Voss said. She went back to her coffee. Outside, the February morning was gray and still. Route 9 was quiet, as it almost always was. The town existed around her in its ordinary weekend way, the 2 traffic lights cycling through their colors for an intersection with almost no traffic, the hardware store not quite closing, the diner open since 1962. She thought about the public phone on the wall outside the ice machine at the motel on Route 12. about a camera angled just slightly wrong, about the particular gap between old, careful habits and one small modern detail. She thought about the way August Keller had placed that bill on the counter with perfectly still hands, the way he had waited in the folding chair for 40 minutes without impatience, the way he had said, when she asked if he was okay, "I'm tired. I've been tired for a long time, but I'm here. So I suppose that's something." She left the diner, walked to her cruiser in the cold February morning, got in, started the engine, looked at the street, at the ordinary small-town Saturday going about its ordinary business. Her radio crackled. Nothing urgent. Noise from the county south of them. She settled back, drank the last of her coffee from the paper cup. She thought about something Walsh had said in their last conversation, before Christmas, on the phone. Walsh had said, "The thing about this work, the legitimate version of it, the version worth doing, is that it depends entirely on people doing small things correctly in ordinary moments. The large events are built from the accumulation of correct small acts. Someone does their job, someone asks a question, someone follows a procedure, and somewhere down the long chain of those ordinary acts, something true surfaces." Voss had thought about that a lot since. She thought about it now. She put the cruiser in drive, pulled onto Route 9, began her morning patrol of a town where nothing significant happened, and where, on one particular Tuesday in October, everything had. The February light was flat and even, the kind of light that shows things clearly without flattery. The hills were bare, the fields were frost-stiff, the highway was empty in both directions, and somewhere in Maryville, Tennessee, in a house with routines built over 50 years, in a street where the neighbors knew him as quiet and reliable, an 83-year-old man was drinking his morning coffee and reading about himself in a newspaper, and setting down the weight he had carried since he was 29 years old, and beginning, carefully, the long and uncertain work of learning how to be himself again. His name was August Caldwell. He had been a ghost for 53 years. He was, at last, allowed to be real. Some bills take 50 years to come due. Some truths wait half a century for the right scanner, on the right counter, on the right ordinary afternoon. Some people live entire lifetimes in the space between who they were and who they were allowed to be. And some gun shops, some markets, some small towns on routes nobody maps, become the place where the distance finally closes. The coffee was getting cold. August Caldwell drank it anyway. He had learned over 53 years to drink cold coffee without complaint. It was one of the small adjustments, one of 1,000 small adjustments made by a man building a life inside a lie, trying to become someone who deserved to exist. He had succeeded, in the end. Not in the way he had planned, not on a timeline that had ever been comfortable, but he had succeeded. The newspaper sat on the table, his name in it, his real name, the names beside his, Marion, Hadley, Brooks. 5 lines of a story that was going to take months and years to fully tell, but which had begun, formally, publicly, irrevocably, on a Tuesday in October when a 19-year-old cashier had run a $100 bill under a scanner in a small market on Route 9. He folded the newspaper, put it down, looked at his hands. Those steady, impossible hands. He was tired. He had been tired for a long time. But he was here, and that, at last, felt like enough. Have you ever witnessed someone receive the recognition they deserved after years of being erased? Drop their story in the comments. And if you believe some truths deserve to be told no matter how long they've waited, subscribe. These people deserve to be remembered. Silence should never be the final answer. She was the witness. The one he had trusted would exist. She sat with the closed notebook and let that settle. Not with grandiosity. There was nothing grand about it. She had done her job correctly. She had asked a human question. She had stayed in the room. It was enough. In the calculus of what mattered, it was exactly enough. Some people spend their entire careers waiting for the one call that changes everything. Most never get it. The career ends in a retirement dinner and a plaque and the accumulated ordinary weight of 1,000 minor incidents, and that is not a failure. That is service, steady and real. But occasionally, in the mathematics of random scheduling and dentist appointments and ultraviolet scanners. The one call arrives on an afternoon that looked like every other afternoon. And what you do with it, in the moment, before you know what it is, determines everything that follows. Voss had done what she always did. She had followed the procedure. She had been honest. She had stayed. That was the whole of it, and it had been sufficient. Outside, the January evening was dark by 5, the hills invisible against the sky. Route 9 ran its quiet ribbon between dark fields. Faber's Mill ran its ordinary rhythms. She put the notebook on the shelf, between the photograph of her father and the ceramic jar. She looked at it there. Then she went to bed. She had an early shift,